The scream that echoed through the Sterling mansion at 3 a.m. wasn't from pain, it was from pure rage. 22-year-old Marcus Sterling hurled his wheelchair against the marble wall of his bedroom, the crash reverberating through the silent corridors like thunder. Blood trickled from his knuckles as he stared at the shattered remnants of yet another failed attempt to stand. 3 years. 3 years since the accident that stole everything. His legs, his dreams, his will to live. But what Marcus didn't know was that tomorrow, a woman would walk through those golden doors and whisper 4 words that would change everything. "I'll help you walk." The Sterling estate sprawled across 50 acres of manicured perfection in the hills of Malibu, where every blade of grass was worth more than most people's annual salary. Inside the mansion's walls, however, perfection had become a prison. Marcus Sterling had once been the golden boy of American aristocracy, Harvard-bound, Olympic swimming prospect, heir to a tech empire worth $12 billion. Now, 3 years after a diving accident that severed his spinal cord, he was a ghost haunting the halls of his own life. His father, Richard Sterling, sat in his mahogany-paneled office overlooking the Pacific, his weathered hands gripping a crystal tumbler of bourbon that had gone untouched for the better part of an hour. The empire he'd built from nothing seemed meaningless when he couldn't fix the one thing that mattered most. His son's broken spirit weighed heavier on his shoulders than any business deal ever had. The voice belonged to Margaret, the head housekeeper who'd been with the family for 15 years. Her gentle British accent carried notes of concern that had become all too familiar. "Master Marcus has dismissed another therapist. That's the 7th one this month." Hours of angry workouts in his private gym had sculpted his upper body into something formidable. But what was strength when it couldn't lift you from your chair? Not the tentative tap of another scared therapist, or the authoritative rap of his father's knuckles. This was confident, measured, almost musical in its rhythm. Marcus didn't bother responding. Whoever it was would leave eventually. They always did. "I didn't say come in," Marcus growled, without turning from where he sat staring out at the endless blue of the Pacific. "Your new trainer." She was strikingly beautiful, yes, with raven black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes the color of emeralds. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped him cold. It was the way she looked at him. Not with pity, or that carefully practiced sympathy he'd grown to despise. She looked at him like he was a puzzle she was genuinely interested in solving. She wore simple black workout clothes that somehow managed to look elegant, and when she smiled, it didn't reach her eyes. There was something there, some shadow of understanding that Marcus couldn't quite place. "Your father hired me," she said, settling into the chair across from his without asking permission. "But I'm not here for him. I'm here because I think you're tired of feeling sorry for yourself." Therapists coddled him. Doctors spoke in careful clinical terms. His father treated him like spun glass. But this woman, this stranger, had just called him out with the casual directness of someone discussing the weather. "You don't know anything about me," Marcus snarled, his famous temper finally finding its target. "I know you were accepted to Harvard with a full academic scholarship, even though your family could afford to buy the university outright." She paused, studying his face with those unsettling green eyes. "And I know that 3 years ago you dove into water that was 2 feet shallower than you thought it was." How did she know so much about him? Elena leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her gaze never leaving his face. "I know because I've had the same dream, Marcus. Maybe not about a cliff, but about the moment everything changed. The moment I stopped believing I could be whole again." 5 years ago, Elena said, her words measured and deliberate, "I was a professional dancer. Ballet. I'd been accepted into the American Ballet Theater, had just landed my first principal role. I was 24 years old and thought I had the world by the throat." She paused, her fingers unconsciously moving to trace a scar along her left thigh that Marcus hadn't noticed before. Then a drunk driver ran a red light. He'd assumed she was just another trainer, another in the long line of well-meaning professionals who thought they could fix him with positive thinking and determination. But the pain in her eyes was real, raw, and utterly familiar. 17 surgeries. They managed to save my leg, but my dancing career was over. The doctors said I'd be lucky to walk normally again, let alone perform. She stood up then, moving across the room with that same fluid grace he'd noticed earlier. They were wrong. I lived in my apartment, ordered takeout, and watched my body waste away while I felt sorry for myself. Sound familiar? But something in Elena's eyes stopped him. She wasn't comparing tragedies or playing a game of who had it worse. She was simply telling him that she understood. Elena smiled then, and this time it did reach her eyes. I got angry, not at the drunk driver or the unfairness of life, but at myself, for wasting the body I still had, for giving up on the parts of me that weren't broken. She moved closer to his chair, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and citrusy that reminded him of better days. I realized that I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I'd forgotten to look for what I might still find. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. What if I told you that with the right training, the right mindset, and a lot of very hard work, there might be hope? Hope could destroy you when it was taken away. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. They were probably right by conventional standards, but I didn't learn to dance again the conventional way. They're doing groundbreaking work with spinal cord injuries using a combination of electrical stimulation, stem cell therapy, and intensive physical rehabilitation. The success rate is low, maybe 15% for cases like yours, but it's not zero. Because I see something in you that you've forgotten exists. The same thing that made you break 3 NCAA records. The same thing that got you into Harvard. The same thing that made you push yourself to be the best at everything you touched. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her skin warm against his cold fingers. Fire, Marcus. You still have fire in you. It's just been pointed in the wrong direction. Curiosity about tomorrow. Then months, maybe years of rehabilitation that would make Navy SEAL training look like a spa weekend. Her voice grew serious. And Marcus, you need to understand this might not work. You might go through all of that and still end up exactly where you are now. Instead, he saw something else. Possibility. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely insane. Elena pushed him harder than anyone had dared in 3 years, demanding excellence not just in his physical training, but in his mental approach to every challenge. When Marcus complained about the difficulty of a particular exercise, she'd remind him that Olympic training had never been comfortable. When he expressed doubt about the experimental treatment, she'd show him videos of other patients who'd made remarkable recoveries. When he retreated into self-pity, she'd call him out with the same direct honesty that had marked their first meeting. She wasn't there because she was paid to be, or because she felt sorry for him. She was there because she believed in him, and that belief was infectious. They talked during their training sessions, long conversations that ranged from his memories of swimming to her life as a dancer to their shared love of classical music. Elena had a sharp wit and an infectious laugh, and Marcus found himself looking forward to their sessions not just for the physical progress, but for the simple pleasure of her company. His son was laughing again, something he hadn't heard in so long that he'd forgotten how much he'd missed it. Marcus was eating better, sleeping through the night, and for the first time since the accident, talking about the future with something other than dread. She's remarkable, Richard told his wife Catherine one evening as they watched Elena and Marcus working together in the gym through the window. Marcus was doing pull-ups, his face set in concentration, while Elena counted reps and offered encouragement. Catherine nodded, her eyes soft with unshed tears. I was beginning to think we'd lost him forever. Late at night, in the small apartment she'd rented near the estate, she'd sit on her couch and massage the ache in her reconstructed leg while reviewing Marcus's progress reports. The Swiss facility had agreed to accept him, but the treatment was experimental and expensive, even by Sterling family standards. Elena had worked with many athletes over the years, helping them recover from career-ending injuries or rebuild their lives after trauma. She'd always maintained professional boundaries, keeping her personal feelings separate from her work. His intelligence, his humor, his incredible determination all combined with a vulnerability that made her want to protect him even as she pushed him to his limits. She found herself thinking about him when she wasn't working, wondering how he was feeling, whether he was having the recurring nightmares he'd mentioned, if he was really ready for what lay ahead in Switzerland. Marcus had noticed the way Elena's eyes would linger on him during particularly challenging exercises, the unconscious way she'd touch his shoulder when offering encouragement, the slight flush in her cheeks when their conversation turned personal. He'd also noticed that she never mentioned a boyfriend or husband, despite the fact that a woman like her surely had men lining up for her attention. Marcus had been attempting a new exercise designed to stimulate neural pathways in his lower spine, and after hours of effort, he'd felt something. Not movement, exactly. but a tingling sensation in his left foot that sent shockwaves of excitement through his entire being. He called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "I felt something!" Her hands moved to his legs, checking for any sign of muscle response, and Marcus felt the familiar electricity that always seemed to spark between them when she... This could mean the neural pathways aren't completely severed. Marcus, this could change everything. Marcus reached up and cupped Elena's face in his hands, pulling her toward him. She didn't resist. Their lips met in a kiss that was desperate and tender, and full of all the emotions they'd been carefully keeping in check for months. Elena's eyes were wide with a mixture of desire and conflict, not just because of the physical sensation in his foot, but because of the woman in his arms who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Elena closed her eyes, her professional training warring with her heart. She'd watched Marcus transform from a broken, angry young man into someone extraordinary. She'd seen his strength, his determination, his capacity for growth, and somewhere along the way, she'd fallen for him completely. "I love you too," she admitted, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "But Marcus, what if the treatment doesn't work? What if I've given you false hope? What if... Whatever happens in Switzerland, whatever the future holds, we'll face it together." The Swiss facility had confirmed Marcus's acceptance into their experimental program, but the treatment would take him away from home for at least 6 months. Elena would accompany him as his primary trainer and advocate, but they both knew that once they crossed that threshold, there would be no going back. Tomorrow, he would leave this room, this house, this carefully constructed life of limitation and safety. Tomorrow, he would bet everything on 15% odds, and the belief that sometimes the impossible was just improbable. Elena found him there as she had so many times before, but this time she didn't knock. She simply entered and crossed to where he sat, placing her hands on his shoulders from behind. "What if my body can't handle the treatment? What if it doesn't?" "Then we'll build a different kind of life," she said simply. "One where you realize that your worth was never measured by whether you could walk. One where you understand that the man I fell in love with isn't defined by what his legs can or can't do." "But Marcus, fear means you're alive. It means you're hoping again, and hope, even when it's terrifying, is always better than despair." Outside, the Pacific rolled endlessly toward shore, carrying with it the promise of new tides and fresh beginnings. Elena had arranged for a medical transport aircraft, complete with specialized equipment and a medical team, but Marcus insisted on using his regular wheelchair. He wasn't ready to be treated as an invalid, not when he was flying toward the possibility of walking again. The Swiss clinic was nestled in the Alps, a modern facility that looked more like a luxury resort than a medical center. Dr. Andreas Müller, the lead researcher, met them personally at the helicopter landing pad. He was a tall, serious man in his 50s, with kind eyes and careful hands that spoke of decades spent working with spinal cord patients. "I must tell you that what we're attempting here is still very experimental. The success rate for cases with your level of injury is approximately 15%, and even in successful cases, the recovery is often partial." But he'd also seen the research, studied the cases of patients who'd regained some degree of function. 15% was better than 0%. MRI scans, nerve conduction studies, muscle biopsies. The tests were exhaustive and sometimes painful, but Marcus endured them all with Elena by his side. There were intact neural pathways that might, with the right stimulation and treatment, be coaxed back to function. The electrical impulses will be delivered through a device implanted near your spinal cord. Combined with stem cell therapy and targeted rehabilitation, this may help restore some neural function. Marcus spent the intervening days in a strange state of suspended animation, caught between anticipation and terror. Elena never left his side, providing support and encouragement even as she wrestled with her own fears about what the future might hold. The night before the surgery, they sat together on the balcony of Marcus's room, looking out at the snow-capped peaks surrounding the clinic. The air was crisp and clean, so different from the salty California breeze they'd both grown accustomed to. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Marcus said, reaching for Elena's hand, "I want you to know that you've already given me back my life. Not my legs, but my life. My hope. My future. I just reminded you who you were underneath all that pain." The stimulation device was implanted without complications, and Marcus recovered from the anesthesia without incident. But the real test would come in the days and weeks that followed. as the electrical impulses began their work of trying to wake up dormant neural pathways. The rehabilitation was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Hours each day were spent in a specialized harness system that supported his weight, while electrical stimulation was delivered to his spinal cord. Physical therapists moved his legs through range-of-motion exercises while the device sent carefully calibrated impulses designed to encourage neural regeneration. The faintest sensation of pressure when his foot was touched. Each tiny advancement was celebrated like a victory, because in the world of spinal cord recovery, every small step was monumental. She could see the changes not just in his body, but in his spirit. The anger that had defined him for 3 years was gone, replaced by a focused determination that reminded her of the Olympic athlete he'd once been. 3 months into the treatment, the breakthrough came during a routine therapy session. Marcus was suspended in the harness system, the electrical stimulation device delivering its programmed impulses, when something extraordinary happened. His right leg moved. Not a reflex or a spasm, but a deliberate, controlled movement in response to his mental command. Elena's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she watched the impossible become reality. After 3 years of stillness, his body was responding to his will again. It was just one leg, just one movement, but it represented everything he'd dared to hope for. But the work was far from over. One moving leg didn't mean he could walk, and partial sensation didn't guarantee full recovery. The next 3 months involved even more intensive rehabilitation, as Marcus worked to strengthen his newly awakened neural pathways and build the muscle control necessary for independent movement. They worked together with a focus and intensity that bordered on obsession, both understanding that they were racing against time and biology to maximize whatever function could be restored. Supported by parallel bars and with a team of therapists standing by, he lifted his right foot and placed it 6 inches forward. Then his left foot, still weaker but responding to his commands, followed suit. It was slow, labored, and required enormous concentration and effort. But it was movement. It was progress. It was proof that sometimes, when you refuse to accept impossible, miracles can happen. He used forearm crutches and his gait was unsteady, but he was on his feet. Elena walked beside him, her hand ready to steady him if needed, her eyes bright with pride and love. Marcus had achieved something extraordinary, but he was also realistic about his limitations. His recovery was partial. He would always need assistive devices to walk, and his mobility would never be what it once was. But he was alive in a way he hadn't been since the accident, and that made every struggle worthwhile. Catherine stood beside him, her hand pressed to her heart as she witnessed the miracle they'd hardly dared to hope for. The media attention was immediate and intense. The story of the paralyzed billionaire's son, who defied medical odds, captured the public imagination, and Marcus found himself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. But he quickly realized that his platform came with responsibility. Working with Elena, he established the Sterling Foundation for Spinal Cord Research, dedicated to funding experimental treatments and supporting other patients pursuing long-shot recoveries. The foundation's first major grant went to Dr. Muller's clinic in Switzerland, ensuring that other patients would have access to the treatment that had changed Marcus's life. Elena officially became the foundation's director of patient advocacy, a role that allowed her to help other families navigate the complex world of experimental medicine, while continuing her work as Marcus's partner in every sense of the word. Their wedding took place 2 years later in the Sterling family garden, with Marcus walking Elena down the aisle they'd created together through sheer force of will and unwavering love. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was the life they'd chosen, built on a foundation of resilience, hope, and the understanding that sometimes the most beautiful journeys begin with the courage to take an impossible leap. As Elena had promised on that first day in his bedroom, Marcus had found his fire again. But more than that, he'd learned that strength isn't measured by what your body can do. It's measured by what your spirit refuses to accept. And sometimes when you combine that inner fire with love, determination, and just a little bit of luck, you can achieve things that doctors say are impossible. It was about the power of human connection to heal wounds that medicine couldn't touch. It was about finding hope in the darkest moments and love in the most unexpected places. Most of all, it was proof that with the right person whispering, "I'll help you," in your ear, there's no limit to how far you can go, whether you're walking, rolling, or flying toward your dreams. But the real test of their transformation came 6 months after their return to California. when tragedy struck again in the most unexpected way. A teenage driver, distracted by his phone, had rear-ended a family sedan at high speed. The car was crumpled like paper, smoke rising from its hood, and Elena could see a small face pressed against the back window. Without hesitation, she pulled over and ran toward the wreckage. The family inside was in shock, but alive. The father had a broken arm, the mother a concussion, but it was their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, who broke Elena's heart. The little girl was conscious but couldn't feel her legs. The impact had compressed her spine in a way that was all too familiar to Elena. "I know it's scary, but you're going to be okay. We're going to take very good care of you." But this time, instead of the grim faces and cautious responses she'd received, Elena had something different to offer. Marcus watched her from his chair, recognizing the familiar intensity in her eyes that had once been focused on his own recovery. Her whole life is ahead of her, and right now, she thinks it's over. Her parents don't have the resources we had. They don't know about the experimental treatments or the possibilities that exist. The foundation wasn't just created for my recovery, Elena. It was created for moments exactly like this. Her parents, David and Maria Gonzalez, were exhausted and overwhelmed, struggling to process medical terminology and treatment options while their world fell apart around them. Elena introduced herself and Marcus, explaining about the foundation and their own experiences with spinal cord injuries. David, a construction worker whose calloused hands shook as he held his wife, looked skeptical. "With respect, sir," David said to Marcus, "you had every advantage money could buy. We're not billionaires. Our insurance won't cover experimental treatments in Switzerland. Not physically, but emotionally. I'd given up completely. I thought my life was over." He gestured to Elena. "This woman taught me that giving up is a choice, and choosing to fight is also a choice. We want to give Sarah the same choice we had." The little girl was remarkable in her resilience. Where Marcus had raged against his fate, Sarah approached her situation with a child's natural adaptability and an 8-year-old's stubborn refusal to accept limitations. Elena found herself learning as much from Sarah as she was teaching. "Miss Elena," Sarah said one afternoon during a physical therapy session, "my mom cries when she thinks I'm not looking. She thinks I don't notice, but I do. Sometimes when people love us, seeing us hurt makes them sad. Being better isn't just about your legs, sweetheart. It's about your whole self." That declaration became Sarah's guiding principle through the months that followed. The experimental treatment approved for her case was less invasive than what Marcus had undergone, involving targeted physical therapy combined with electrical stimulation and a modified stem cell therapy protocol designed specifically for pediatric patients. Elena documented every session, every small victory, every setback. Sarah's progress was different from Marcus's. Where his recovery had been marked by dramatic breakthroughs, hers was more gradual, measured in millimeters of sensation and tiny improvements in muscle control. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in Elena herself. Working with Sarah awakened something maternal in her that she hadn't known existed. She found herself thinking about the future not just in terms of her life with Marcus, but in terms of the family they might build together. Marcus noticed the change in his wife, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about Sarah's progress, the tender way she tucked a blanket around the sleeping child during long therapy sessions. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from their terrace, he broached the subject that had been growing in both their minds. Elena leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting on his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. "I never thought I did. After my accident, after losing Dance, I convinced myself that I didn't want the traditional things. Marriage, family, all of that seemed like consolation prizes." He paused, his hand finding hers. "But Sarah has taught me something important. Children don't see limitations the way adults do. They see possibilities." "That's a yes," Marcus confirmed, lifting her hand to his lips to press a gentle kiss to her palm. The little girl was lying in her hospital bed, her right foot moving up and down in small but deliberate motions, while her parents wept with joy. Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "How does it feel?" "There are so many ways to move and be beautiful." Within 6 months, Elena had partnered with physical therapists, dance instructors, and child psychologists to develop a comprehensive program that combined artistic expression with physical rehabilitation. The program's first recital took place in the Sterling family ballroom. which had been converted into a performance space complete with professional lighting and sound equipment. Sarah, now able to walk short distances with assistance, performed a piece she had choreographed herself, combining traditional ballet movements with wheelchair-based dance elements. But the real star of the evening was Elena, who took the stage for the first time since her accident 5 years earlier. She had spent months secretly preparing, working with a choreographer to create a piece that incorporated her reconstructed leg's limitations while celebrating the strength she had found in adaptation. Marcus watched from the front row, tears streaming down his face as his wife moved across the stage with a grace and power that transcended any physical limitations. This wasn't the Elena who had been broken by her accident, or even the Elena who had learned to walk again. This was someone entirely new, forged by love, purpose, and the understanding that healing others often completes our own recovery. The performance ended with Elena and Sarah dancing together, their movements telling a story of resilience, hope, and the beautiful truth that sometimes our greatest strength comes from what we've overcome, rather than what we've achieved without struggle. After the recital, as guests mingled and children who had never expected to perform again basked in applause, Marcus found Elena on the terrace where they had shared so many important conversations. Elena asked. But as she stood in her husband's arms, surrounded by the sounds of celebration and the knowledge that they had helped create something beautiful from tragedy, she knew that moment would come soon. The Sterling Foundation continued to expand its reach, funding research facilities around the world and providing support for families facing spinal cord injuries. Marcus became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story at medical conferences and fundraising events, always crediting Elena with giving him back not just his mobility, but his purpose. She traveled frequently, training instructors and visiting children whose lives had been changed by accident or illness. Each trip strengthened her conviction that their foundation was doing more than funding medical research. It was restoring hope to families who had lost it. But perhaps the most profound change came in their personal lives. Their son, Daniel Marcus Sterling, was born on a crisp autumn morning exactly 2 years after Sarah's first steps. Marcus, who had once believed he could never be a complete father due to his limitations, discovered that parenting had very little to do with physical ability and everything to do with presence, patience, and unconditional love. Elena, holding their newborn son while sitting in the same garden where she had first challenged Marcus to fight for his recovery, marveled at how far they had all come. The angry, broken young man she had met in that mansion bedroom was now a devoted husband and father, a successful foundation director, and living proof that the human spirit could overcome almost anything when supported by love and determination. Sarah, now 12 years old and walking independently with only minor assistance devices, visited often. She had become something of a poster child for the foundation, but more importantly, she had become family. Her own recovery had plateaued at about 60% function, but she had adapted brilliantly, incorporating her unique movement style into a dance technique that was gaining recognition in the adaptive arts community. "Miss Elena," Sarah said during one of her visits, as she held baby Daniel while Elena prepared lunch. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day? When you saw my accident?" "I think about it sometimes. But Sarah, I didn't stop because I'm some kind of hero. I stopped because I recognized something in that moment. I saw myself 8 years ago, lying in a hospital bed thinking my life was over. All I did was remind you that saving yourself was possible." The view hadn't changed. The Pacific still rolled endlessly toward shore. But everything else was different. It redirected it toward something more meaningful than I ever could have imagined. He would never have founded the research program that's helping dozens of families. He certainly would never have appreciated what a gift it is to find someone who sees your worst moments and chooses to love you anyway. Inside the Sterling mansion, 3 lives intertwined by circumstance and choice had created something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The foundation they had built would go on to help thousands of families, funding breakthrough research and providing hope to children like Sarah who faced seemingly impossible odds. The adaptive arts program would evolve into a global movement, changing how society viewed disability and artistic expression. Because sometimes, when life breaks you down completely, you have the opportunity to rebuild yourself into something stronger, more compassionate, and more purposeful than you ever imagined possible. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone willing to help you do the rebuilding. Someone who whispers, "I'll help you," in your darkest moment and means it with their whole heart. In those moments, miracles become not just possible, but inevitable. But the true measure of their transformation would be tested one final time, in a way none of them could have predicted. Muller's voice was grave as he delivered news that no one wanted to hear. The experimental treatment that had saved Marcus was showing unexpected long-term complications in some patients. Muller explained during an emergency video conference, appears to be causing progressive nerve damage in approximately 8% of patients who received the treatment more than 4 years ago. The symptoms include increasing pain, loss of sensation, and in some cases, deterioration of the recovered function. He had been one of the first patients to undergo the experimental treatment, and his device had been active for over 5 years. Elena's hand found his, squeezing tightly as they processed the devastating possibility that his hard-won recovery might be temporary. Elena asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. Or we can monitor the situation closely and hope that Marcus is among the 92% who don't develop complications. Remove the device and certainly lose the ability to walk, or keep it and risk progressive nerve damage that could be even more devastating than his original injury. Through the baby monitor, he could hear Daniel's soft breathing, and down the hall, their second child, 2-year-old Isabella, stirred occasionally in her sleep. The family he had never dared dream of having was now his greatest treasure, and the thought of becoming more disabled, more dependent, terrified him in a way that his original accident never had. The man lying in this bed wasn't the same person who had thrown his wheelchair against the wall in rage 6 years earlier. That man had defined himself by what his body could do. This man, husband, father, foundation director, was defined by so much more. When Elena woke, she found Marcus already dressed and sitting in his wheelchair by the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. But Elena, if the symptoms develop, if I start to deteriorate, I want you to promise me something. What we've accomplished, what we've built together, none of that disappears if I lose the ability to walk again. The foundation, the adaptive arts program, our children, our love. Those things aren't dependent on whether I can stand up. I promise, she whispered, leaning down to kiss the top of his head. But Marcus, you should know something. The man I fell in love with wasn't the one who could walk. It was the one who refused to give up, who turned his pain into purpose, who chose to fight when fighting seemed impossible. That man is still here, regardless of what happens with your legs. Marcus underwent regular neurological evaluations while continuing his work with the Foundation, which had grown into a global organization funding spinal cord research in 12 countries. The Adaptive Arts program now served over 3,000 children worldwide, with Sarah, now 15 and the accomplished dancer, serving as a youth ambassador. The angry, broken young man who had pushed away everyone who tried to help seemed like a stranger now. In his place was someone who had learned that strength wasn't about what your body could do, but about what your spirit refused to surrender. The Foundation's annual gala that year was particularly meaningful. Held in the grand ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel, it brought together families whose lives had been touched by spinal cord injuries, researchers working on cutting-edge treatments, and donors who believed in the power of hope over despair. Marcus's keynote speech that evening was different from any he had given before. Instead of focusing on his physical recovery, he spoke about the deeper transformations that had occurred along the way. 6 years ago, he began, looking out at the audience of nearly 1,000 people. I measured my worth by swimming times and academic achievements. I thought success meant being faster, stronger, better than everyone else. Then, in one moment, all of that was taken away, and I thought my life was over. What I didn't understand then was that losing everything I thought I was gave me the chance to discover who I actually am. I am not a man who happens to be in a wheelchair. I am not a patient who got lucky with an experimental treatment. I am a husband who found love in the most unexpected place. I am a father raising children who will grow up understanding that everyone's journey is different, and that's what makes life beautiful. I am the director of a foundation that has helped over 2,000 families find hope when they thought there was none left. But here's what I know for certain. The real healing that happened over these past 6 years can never be taken away. Love, purpose, connection, hope. These things don't require working legs. They require a working heart, and mine has never been stronger. Marcus, she said when she approached him after the speech. I want you to know something. When I was 8 years old and couldn't move my legs, You and Miss Elena didn't just help me walk again. You taught me that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. Whether you can walk or not, you'll always be the person who saved my life by showing me I could save myself." The neurological tests confirmed what they had all feared. His body was beginning to reject the electrical stimulation device. The procedure was routine from a technical standpoint, but everyone understood what it meant. Marcus would lose most of his recovered mobility, returning to the wheelchair that had been his companion for 3 years before the experimental treatment. The night before the surgery, Marcus sat in the garden with Elena and their children. Daniel, now 6, was old enough to understand that his father was about to face a significant change, while 3-year-old Isabella simply enjoyed being held in her daddy's lap. Daniel asked with the directness that children bring to difficult topics. But now, surrounded by his family in the garden where he had first found hope, he realized that his answer was more complex. "But Daniel, do you know what makes me happy every single day?" "Those things make me so happy that any sadness about my legs seems very small in comparison." Within a week, he was back in his wheelchair full-time, but his spirits remained remarkably high. If anything, he seemed more at peace than he had been during the months of uncertainty. The man who had once raged against the limitations of his wheelchair now embraced it as simply another tool that allowed him to live his life fully. He modified his office at the foundation to better accommodate his needs, had their home's already accessible features updated for greater efficiency, and continued his work without missing a beat. The most remarkable change, however, was in how Marcus interacted with newly injured patients and their families. His experience of losing recovered function and adapting again gave him a unique perspective that proved invaluable in his counseling work. The hardest part, he told a young woman named Rachel who had been paralyzed in a skiing accident, isn't the initial injury. It's learning to rebuild your sense of self around a new reality. I've done it twice now, once when I was first injured, and again last year when I lost the ability to walk again. Each time I discovered that I was more resilient than I thought, and that happiness doesn't depend on your body working the way you expect it to. That hope led me to Elena, to our children, to the foundation, to thousands of families we've been able to help. Even if I had known the treatment would be temporary, I would have done it again in a heartbeat, because it set me on the path to the life I was meant to live. Elena, meanwhile, had expanded the adaptive arts program into something far beyond what she had originally envisioned. The program now included not just dance, but music, visual arts, theater, and creative writing. Children and adults with various disabilities were discovering that artistic expression could be a powerful tool for processing trauma and building confidence. The program's crown jewel was the annual Unbroken Festival, a week-long celebration of adaptive arts that drew participants and audiences from around the world. The festival featured performances, workshops, and exhibitions that challenged traditional notions of what art could be and who could create it. She had choreographed a piece called Rising, which told the story of her own journey from dancer to patient to healer. The performance incorporated elements of her classical ballet training with movements that acknowledged her reconstructed leg and the strength she had found in adaptation. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus joined her on stage. Rolling onto the performance space in his wheelchair, he became part of the choreography, his upper body movements complementing Elena's as they told their story together through dance. The piece concluded with Elena seated in Marcus's lap, both of them moving in perfect synchronization as the music swelled around them. But for Marcus and Elena, the performance represented something even more profound: the complete integration of their journey into art that could inspire others facing similar challenges. One, from a mother in Ohio whose teenage son had been paralyzed in a football accident, particularly moved them. He's always loved theater, but since his injury, he's convinced himself that chapter of his life is over. After seeing your festival online, he's asked me to help him find an adaptive arts program in our area. You've given him back his dreams in a different form, and for that, our family will be forever grateful. The foundation had evolved beyond medical research into a comprehensive support system that addressed the emotional, creative, and spiritual needs of people facing life-altering challenges. As Daniel grew older, he began to understand more fully the remarkable story of his parents' meeting and the journey they had taken together. On his 7th birthday, he asked his father to tell him again about the night he threw his wheelchair against the wall. Daniel asked as they sat together in Marcus's study, the same room where Elena had first researched treatments for his condition. I was angry because I thought being in a wheelchair meant I couldn't have the life I wanted. I didn't understand yet that I could have a different life that was just as good, maybe even better. I was very wrong, Marcus agreed. And I'm grateful every day that Mommy helped me see that. And I want to help them find their new dreams when their old ones get hurt. It was raising children who understood from their earliest days that everyone's journey is valuable, that challenges can become strengths, and that love has the power to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful. That night, as Elena tucked Isabella into bed and Marcus helped Daniel with his reading, they reflected on how far they had come from that first meeting in his bedroom 6 years earlier. The angry, hopeless young man and the determined trainer, who had seen potential where others saw only limitations, had built something extraordinary together. It was something more real, more tested, more beautiful for having been forged in struggle and strengthened by shared purpose. They had learned that sometimes the most profound love grows not from perfection, but from seeing someone at their worst and choosing to believe in their capacity for transformation. He was transferring from his wheelchair to their bed with the efficient movements of someone completely comfortable with his body and its capabilities. There was no frustration in his face, no lingering anger at his limitations. There was only contentment, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world. I'm thinking about how grateful I am for that angry young man who threw his wheelchair against the wall 6 years ago. And someone who's still fighting can be saved. Someone who's still fighting can save others. Someone who's still fighting can build something beautiful from the wreckage of their original plans. And in cities around the world, children and adults facing their own seemingly impossible challenges went to bed with a little more hope, knowing that somewhere, two people who understood their struggle were working to ensure that no one had to face their darkest moments alone. The story of Marcus and Elena Sterling would continue to unfold in the lives they touched, the research they funded, the dreams they helped rebuild, and the love they had proven was stronger than any obstacle. Their legacy lived not in the miracle of recovered mobility, but in the deeper miracle of two broken people choosing to heal together and using their healing to light the way for others walking similar paths. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Elena would remember that first day in Marcus's room, when she had looked at a young man destroyed by circumstance and seen not his limitations, but his possibilities. She had whispered 4 simple words that changed both their lives forever. "I'll help you walk." She had meant it literally then, but she understood now that the most important walking they had done together was the journey from despair to hope, from isolation to love, from brokenness to wholeness. A journey measured not in steps, but in the courage to keep moving forward, together.